It was a fine spring evening in London, and the fashionable Bloomsbury Square bustled with the gaiety of the season. The blossoms on the plane trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the elegant facades of the surrounding townhouses glowed in the late sunlight. In one such house, belonging to the prosperous financier, Sir Charles Weatherby, a soirée was in full swing. Guests clad in tailored evening attire moved between the drawing-room and the garden terrace, their conversations light and polished, mingled with the strains of a string quartet. In the midst of this genteel gathering stood Miss Margaret Lisle, Sir Charles's efficient and unobtrusive private secretary. Slim and plain, with neatly pinned dark hair and a reserved demeanor, she was not the sort to command attention. Yet tonight she seemed more tense than usual, casting wary glances at the doorway. Sir Charles himself was in his element, recounting his latest business triumph to a small group of admiring listeners. Tall and imposing, his ruddy face framed by a well-groomed beard, he gestured expansively. His wife, Lady Weatherby, a fragile-looking woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, stood at his side, smiling absently. Suddenly, the festivities were interrupted by a sharp, anguished cry from the hallway. A maid rushed in, her face ashen. "It's Miss Lisle, sir. She's in the study. Oh, it's awful." Guests turned their heads in shock as Sir Charles hurried from the room, Lady Weatherby close behind. In the study, they found Margaret Lisle sprawled on the floor, her hands clutching a small folded note. Her face was pale, and her eyes stared, unseeing at the ornate ceiling. Sir Charles knelt and touched her neck, his face stricken. "She's dead," he whispered. A murmur spread among the guests as Lady Weatherby sank into a chair, trembling. The butler, Harrington, appeared at the doorway, clearly distressed. "The police, sir?" he inquired quietly. "Yes, at once," Sir Charles muttered, his voice thick with shock. As the guests whispered in low, urgent tones, a tall, handsome man with a purposeful stride stepped forward. Inspector James Felton of Scotland Yard, who had been attending the soirée as Lady Weatherby's cousin, took charge. He sent the guests back to the drawing-room, leaving the study in sombre quiet. Felton bent over the body, examining the note still clutched in Miss Lisle's hand. He gently pried it free, unfolding it with careful precision. His brow furrowed as he read the brief, cryptic message. "I know the truth. M.L." He glanced back at the guests, clustered anxiously in the doorway, his gaze landing on Sir Charles. "Was Miss Lisle in any kind of trouble?" Felton asked, his tone professional. Sir Charles shook his head emphatically. "Not at all. Margaret was reliable, discreet, one of the best secretaries I've ever employed." Lady Weatherby, still pale, whispered, "She was always so quiet. I never knew her to quarrel with anyone." Felton frowned thoughtfully. "We'll need to question everyone here, but first, I'd like to send for a detective with a particularly keen mind. This death, it doesn't feel right." With a sudden, decisive nod, he turned to Harrington. "Please send a message to Mr. Hercule Poirot. Tell him it is a matter of utmost urgency." And so, amid the flickering lamplight and whispering guests, the stage was set for Hercule Poirot to unravel a mystery where death had struck unexpectedly in a house filled with secrets. As the evening air grew cooler, the guests in Sir Charles Weatherby's drawing-room exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations reduced to tense whispers. The tragic, unexpected death of Margaret Lisle had cast a shadow over the once lively soirée, turning the clinking of champagne glasses into a distant, ghostly echo. Inspector James Felton, having dispatched the butler Harrington to summon Hercule Poirot, remained alone in the dimly lit study, kneeling beside the lifeless form of the secretary. The fire in the corner crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the rich mahogany paneling, while the scent of leather-bound volumes and aged parchment hung in the air, a fitting atmosphere for a sudden, inexplicable death. Felton's eyes lingered on the small folded note he had taken from Miss Lisle's stiffened fingers. I know the truth. M.L. The message was a stark, chilling puzzle, raising more questions than it answered. What truth had she discovered? And why had it been worth her life? As he straightened, the door creaked open, and a short, impeccably dressed figure stepped into the room. His patent leather shoes clicked softly against the polished wood, and his mustache, a carefully waxed masterpiece, twitched with interest. Hercule Poirot paused for a moment, his keen eyes absorbing the scene with the precision of a master painter contemplating a canvas. "Mon cher Felton," he said, his accent crisp and his tone polite yet direct, "I came at once when I received your message. You said it was a matter of urgency. I see now that you spoke no exaggeration." Felton rose, offering a curt nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Poirot. I knew you'd want to see this for yourself." He gestured to the body. "Margaret Lyle, Sir Charles Weatherby's private secretary, found dead just minutes ago with this in her hand." Poirot stepped closer, his head tilting as he studied the lifeless face of the young woman. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now hung loosely around her pale cheeks, and her eyes stared blankly into the distance. He reached for the note, his gloved fingers delicate as a surgeon's, and read the message without a word. He turned to the inspector, one eyebrow lifting in mild surprise. "And the manner of death, mon ami? Has it been determined?" Felton's jaw tightened. "Not yet. There are no obvious wounds, no signs of struggle. If I didn't know better, I'd say she, simply, collapsed." Poirot's eyes sparkled with sudden interest. He leaned closer, examining the faint bluish tinge around the woman's lips, then carefully sniffed the air. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of understanding passing across his sharp features. "Ah," he murmured. "It is possible that Mademoiselle Lyle did not meet her end through violence, but through more subtle means. Perhaps a poison, delicately administered, leaving no immediate trace. Yes, this is a puzzle, most intriguing." Felton watched him with the strained patience of a man accustomed to more straightforward police work. "You think it's poison, then?" Poirot straightened, his hands clasped neatly before him. "It is a possibility, but one must never leap to conclusions, my friend. No, we must consider all things, the motive, the opportunity, the means. Already I see that this note is the key." He held the small piece of paper aloft, turning it this way and that beneath the light of the study lamp. His lips pursed thoughtfully. "It is a curious thing," Poirot continued, "to leave such a message. I know the truth. It is a statement of knowledge, of certainty. Yet Mademoiselle Lyle was a secretary, precise, cautious. She would not make such a declaration lightly. No, there is something more here." Felton shifted, clearly eager to press forward. "Shall I begin questioning the guests?" Poirot's sharp eyes met his, and for a moment the two men shared a silent understanding. Poirot, with his intense focus on the human mind, and Felton with his sharp, practical instincts, each a master in his own right, but approaching the hunt for truth from distinctly different directions. "Yes, that is wise," Poirot agreed, his tone firm. "But I shall begin, if you permit, with those closest to the deceased. Sir Charles and Lady Weatherby, perhaps, and the butler, Harrington. He may have observed more than he realizes." Felton nodded, stepping toward the door. "I'll clear the room and have them brought in." As the inspector exited, Poirot took a final, lingering look at the dead woman. His mind worked quickly, sorting the scant clues, piecing together the fragments of a life abruptly ended. The note in his hand felt oddly heavy, as though it carried the weight of a far more sinister secret than the few words it contained. Outside, the murmur of nervous voices grew louder as Felton moved through the drawing room, instructing the guests to remain calm and await their turn to speak. The clinking of glassware had ceased, and the faint strains of the quartet had faded into an awkward, uncertain silence. Poirot, adjusting his cuffs with the meticulous care of a man who valued order above all else, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He sensed that this case, with its sudden death and whispered truths, would prove worthy of his little grey cells. And as the first pieces of the puzzle began to align in his mind, he felt the first stirrings of anticipation, the quiet thrill that came with every new mystery, every chance to pierce the veils of human deception and reveal the truth beneath. The door to the study closed quietly behind Felton, leaving Poirot alone once more with the silent figure of Margaret Lyle. He moved to the desk, his polished shoes making only the faintest sound on the hardwood floor. The leather-bound ledger, still open where Miss Lyle had likely been working, caught his eye. He glanced at the neat, precise columns of figures, entries meticulously noted in her small, careful hand. Poirot reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, gleaming magnifying glass. He leaned in, examining the pages with the intense scrutiny of a jeweler inspecting a rare diamond. There, beside a fresh entry, a faint smudge of ink marred the otherwise immaculate column. A detail most would overlook, but to Poirot it spoke volumes. Miss Lyle had been interrupted, perhaps startled at a critical moment. He straightened, his mind already weaving a delicate web of possibilities. The note clutched in her hand, the hasty, desperate scrawl, suggested fear, a realization of imminent danger. Yet Miss Lyle had been known for her composure, her quiet, methodical nature. What then had shattered that calm so abruptly? The door opened again, and Inspector Felton re-entered, followed by Sir Charles Weatherby. The financier's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped into the room. Poirot noted the small bead of perspiration tracing a path down the man's temple, the tightness around his mouth. "Please sit," Poirot said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite the desk. Sir Charles sank into it, his hands clasped tightly together. Felton took a position near the door, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, then met Sir Charles's gaze with a look of quiet intensity. "I am deeply sorry for the loss of your secretary, Sir Charles," he began, his tone grave but measured. "I understand that Miss Lyle had been in your employ for some years." Sir Charles nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he swallowed. "Yes, nearly 5 years. She was reliable, efficient. I trusted her with all my business affairs." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Yet trust, Sir Charles, is a curious thing. It is often given freely, but rarely without reservation. Tell me, was there any reason for Miss Lyle to be discontented? Any recent disagreements? Perhaps a matter of money or loyalty?" The financier hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly to the shadowed corners of the room, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "No, nothing of the sort," he said, his voice strained. "She was paid well, and she had my complete confidence. There was no reason for her to be unhappy." Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his eyes unblinking. "And yet you found her dead, a cryptic note in her hand, hinting at some hidden truth. Curious thing, no? One does not write such a note without cause." Sir Charles' lips tightened, his jaw clenching visibly. I don't understand it. Margaret was loyal. She had no secrets." Poirot's head tilted slightly, the light catching the glossy sheen of his black hair. "No secrets, you say? And yet the note speaks of a truth she had discovered, a truth she believed worth risking her life for, perhaps." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken fears. Poirot watched Sir Charles closely, noting the way the man's fingers dug into the leather armrest, the slight tremor in his left hand. It was the posture of a man holding something back, struggling to maintain control. Felton stepped forward, his tone firm. "Sir Charles, was there anything unusual about Miss Lyle's behavior in recent days? Any signs that she felt threatened or uneasy?" Sir Charles's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as though the question itself were an affront. "No," he said sharply. "Nothing at all. She went about her duties as always. If she had concerns, she kept them to herself." Poirot's gaze flicked to the ledger still open on the desk, then back to Sir Charles. "You will permit me to ask a delicate question, Sir Charles. Are your business dealings perhaps of a nature that might invite difficulty?" The financier's eyes hardened, his nostrils flaring slightly. "My affairs are perfectly legitimate, Monsieur Poirot. I have nothing to hide." Poirot held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Bien. We shall proceed on that assumption, then." He rose, smoothing the front of his jacket. "I shall need to speak with Lady Weatherby and the rest of your household. In matters such as these, even the smallest detail may prove vital." Sir Charles's shoulders slumped slightly, the defiance in his eyes dimming as the full weight of the situation settled upon him. He rose, his movements stiff and mechanical, and exited the study without another word. Felton watched him go, then turned back to Poirot, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "He's hiding something," the inspector muttered, his jaw set. "I can feel it." Poirot smiled faintly, his mustache lifting at the corners. "Ah, mon cher Felton, you have the instincts of a hunter, but you must learn patience. The truth is like a fine wine. It must be coaxed gently from the cask, not forced." Felton's frown deepened, but he nodded, stepping aside as Poirot moved toward the door. The Belgian detective paused for a moment on the threshold, his eyes drifting back to the still form of Margaret Lyle, her face frozen in a final, silent plea. "Fear not, mademoiselle," he whispered softly, his eyes gleaming with quiet resolve. "Your secret shall not remain buried." He stepped into the hallway, the polished wood floor creaking faintly beneath his weight. The murmur of anxious voices drifted from the drawing room, where guests clutched their champagne glasses with trembling hands and whispered of sudden death and dark secrets. Poirot straightened his jacket, his mind already sorting through the fragments of the puzzle. The note, the ledger, the faint scent of almonds lingering in the study. All small details, yet together they hinted at a deeper, more insidious truth. And as he approached the drawing room, he felt the first flicker of certainty, a faint but unmistakable sense that the pieces were beginning to align. The game, as they say, was afoot. Poirot entered the drawing room with a purposeful step, his eyes sweeping over the cluster of guests still lingering in nervous conversation. The air was thick with whispers, the sharp scent of perfume mingling with the faint tang of smoke from the extinguished fireplace. He noted the way the guests leaned in toward each other, their expressions strained, their eyes darting toward the study door as though fearing the shadow of death itself might slip through the narrow crack. Lady Weatherby sat rigidly on a velvet settee, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the Persian carpet beneath her feet. Beside her, a tall, striking woman in a shimmering silver gown murmured soft words of comfort. Poirot recognized her at once as Miss Beatrice Cavendish, a family friend and frequent guest at the Weatherby residence. The butler, Harrington, hovered near the doorway, his tall, angular frame stiff with barely contained anxiety. His eyes flicked toward Poirot as the detective approached, and he gave a small, respectful nod. Poirot's gaze swept the room once more, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the tightened jaws, the nervous glances. The scent of fear was palpable, a sharp, acrid undercurrent beneath the polished veneer of high society. He moved to Lady Weatherby's side, his steps measured, his expression grave yet calm. "Madame," he said gently, inclining his head, "permit me to offer my deepest condolences. This is a tragedy most profound." Lady Weatherby's head lifted slowly, her eyes, a startling blue against her pale complexion, locking on to Poirot's with a hint of desperation. "It is unthinkable," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Poor Margaret. I cannot believe it." Poirot reached for a nearby chair, lowering himself with the careful precision of a man for whom order was both a habit and a comfort. He studied Lady Weatherby closely, noting the faint quiver of her hands, the tightness around her eyes, the slight flush creeping up her delicate neck. "Madame, if you would indulge me, I must ask you a few questions. I promise to be brief." Lady Weatherby nodded, her fingers twisting the lace of her sleeve. Had Miss Lyle, in recent days, seemed troubled? Poirot's tone was gentle, his words carefully chosen. Perhaps distracted or anxious? Did you notice any change in her demeanor? Lady Weatherby hesitated, her gaze drifting to the grand piano in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the flickering firelight. "Now that you mention it," she murmured, her brow furrowing, "Margaret did seem distant, not quite herself. I thought perhaps it was a matter of health or a personal worry, but she said nothing to me." Poirot's eyes sharpened, his head tilting slightly. "Did she speak with anyone in particular this evening? Perhaps a conversation that seemed intense?" Lady Weatherby's gaze flicked briefly to Miss Cavendish, who had straightened slightly at Poirot's approach, her dark eyes narrowing with interest. The two women exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. "No," Lady Weatherby replied, her tone guarded. She kept to herself as usual. Margaret was never one to seek the spotlight. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled before him. "And yet, madame, she left behind a note that suggests she had uncovered a truth, something she felt compelled to record even at the moment of her death." Lady Weatherby's eyes widened, her breath catching audibly. Beside her, Miss Cavendish shifted, a delicate hand rising to adjust the shimmering clasp at her throat. "Surely you do not think—" Lady Weatherby began, her voice breaking. She could not have been involved in something. Poirot's sharp eyes did not miss the sudden flicker of fear in her gaze. He leaned forward slightly, his tone growing firmer. "Madame, the smallest detail, the most fleeting impression, can be the key to understanding. I must ask you to think carefully. Did Miss Lyle have any particular confidants among your guests? Someone she might have trusted with a secret?" Lady Weatherby's head dropped, her fingers twisting together with renewed intensity. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "Margaret was private. Always private." Poirot allowed a small, thoughtful nod, his mind already leaping ahead, weaving connections, probing the shadows for hints of hidden truths. He turned his attention to Miss Cavendish, whose sharp, assessing gaze had never left his face. "Mademoiselle Cavendish," he said, his tone shifting to a subtle note of challenge. "You and Miss Lyle, were you friends, perhaps?" Miss Cavendish's eyes narrowed, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, betraying a flash of irritation. "I knew her, of course," she replied, her voice smooth but lacking the warmth of genuine sentiment. "But I would not say we were close. She was a servant, after all." Poirot's head tilted, his moustache twitching slightly. But sometimes the barriers of class are not so impermeable as they seem. You spoke just now of Margaret in the past tense, as though you had already come to terms with her death. Curious, is it not?" Miss Cavendish's eyes flashed, her mouth tightening into a thin line. "I merely spoke plainly, Monsieur Poirot. I am not one for sentimental falsehoods." Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "Indeed. And yet truth, mademoiselle, is a thing most delicate. It must be handled with care, lest it slip through one's fingers." Miss Cavendish's dark eyes held his for a moment longer, then she turned sharply, rising from the settee with a graceful sweep of her gown. "If you will excuse me," she said coolly, "I find this conversation most distasteful." She glided toward the far end of the room, her head held high, the soft rustle of silk trailing in her wake. Poirot watched her go, his expression thoughtful, his mind already cataloguing the subtle cues, the whispered hints of hidden enmity. He turned back to Lady Weatherby, who sat motionless, her gaze still fixed on the carpet, her hands trembling in her lap. "Merci, madame," he said softly, rising from his chair. "You have been most helpful." As he stepped back into the hallway, the faint strains of a clock chimed from the far end of the house, each note a reminder that time, like the truth, waited for no one. Poirot paused, his keen mind sifting through the fragments of conversation, the fleeting glances, the carefully chosen words. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, each detail a thread leading toward the hidden heart of the mystery. And already, Poirot felt the familiar, electric thrill of revelation beginning to stir within him. Poirot moved quietly through the hallway, his mind a careful balance of calm observation and sharp analysis. The guest's nervous whispers from the drawing-room faded into the distance as he approached the narrow staircase leading to the servants' quarters. He paused for a moment, straightening his cuffs with a deliberate precision, then ascended the stairs, each step a measured, thoughtful cadence. At the top, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint, comforting scent of freshly laundered linen and beeswax polish. The servants' domain, so often the hidden heart of a grand house, held its own secrets, its own intrigues. Poirot moved down the narrow, carpeted corridor, his steps light, his eyes sharp for any sign of recent disturbance. He reached the small, plainly furnished room that had belonged to Margaret Lyle. The door stood slightly ajar, the brass handle cool beneath his fingers as he eased it open. The room within was as orderly as he had expected. Neatly made bed, the thin coverlet pulled tight, a small writing desk against the wall, its surface free of clutter save for a single framed photograph and a well-worn leather notebook. Poirot stepped inside, his sharp eyes moving quickly over the simple furnishings, noting the absence of any personal touches beyond the photograph. A faded image of a stern-looking older woman, perhaps a mother or a maiden aunt, her expression one of quiet disapproval. He reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing the smooth, creased leather cover. As he opened it, the faintest scent of lavender reached his nose, a subtle, calming perfume. He flipped through the pages, each filled with Margaret's precise, elegant handwriting, daily notes, household accounts, the occasional personal reflection, though always guarded, always cautious. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he reached the final pages. Here the handwriting had grown smaller, more hurried, as though written in haste or under duress. He leaned in, his brows drawing together as he read. "I must be careful. He watches me closely. He suspects that I know. I must not let him see my fear." Poirot's lips tightened, a faint, satisfied glimmer in his eyes. He flipped to the very last entry, where the ink was darker, the pressure on the pen firmer, as though Margaret had been struggling to convey a final, urgent message. "It is not just the money. It is the betrayal. I cannot keep silent forever." Poirot closed the notebook gently, his mind already leaping ahead, connecting fragments of overheard conversations, strained glances, and whispered fears. Margaret Lyle, for all her quiet efficiency, had clearly discovered something dangerous, something that had pushed her to the edge of caution and, ultimately, beyond it. He slipped the notebook into his jacket pocket, then turned, his gaze falling on the small, narrow wardrobe beside the bed. He opened it, revealing a row of simple, well-pressed blouses and skirts, their hangers perfectly aligned, their collars crisp and freshly starched. Yet here, too, his sharp eyes detected a subtle incongruity, the faint, irregular scrape of the wardrobe's wooden base against the floor, as though it had recently been moved. Poirot reached down, gripping the wardrobe's side and giving it a gentle nudge. It shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap behind it, a gap just wide enough to conceal a small metal box. He knelt, his fingers probing the shadows until they brushed cool steel. He pulled the box free, its surface scratched and tarnished, the small brass lock still intact. He held it up, his eyes narrowing with interest. Here, perhaps, lay the key to Margaret's final secret. He tucked the box beneath his arm, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Poirot straightened, giving the small room one final, sweeping glance. Satisfied that he had uncovered all it had to offer, he stepped back into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind him. As he descended the stairs, he caught sight of Inspector Felton emerging from the drawing room, his broad shoulders stiff with barely concealed frustration. The inspector spotted Poirot and approached, his brow furrowed, his jaw set. "Anything of interest?" Felton asked, his tone clipped. Poirot allowed himself a small, enigmatic smile. "Ah, my friend, interest is a matter of perspective. I've discovered a few small details, yes. Enough, perhaps, to cast a new light on our dear Miss Lyle's final days." Felton's eyes narrowed, his suspicion evident. "And you mean to share these details, I hope?" Poirot's smile widened slightly, his mustache lifting at the corners. "But of course, mon ami. First, however, I must speak with our good butler, Harrington. I suspect he has seen much, though perhaps he does not yet realize it." Felton grunted, his expression a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. "Very well. I'll gather the rest of the staff. Perhaps it's time we heard their side of things." Poirot nodded, watching as Felton turned sharply and strode down the hallway, his footsteps heavy, his shoulders set with the determination of a man accustomed to forcing answers from unwilling lips. Poirot, for his part, took a more measured approach, his steps slow, his mind already sorting through the implications of Margaret's final, desperate words. He entered the kitchen, its warm, brightly lit space a stark contrast to the darkened hallways above. The staff stood in a nervous cluster near the long, scarred wooden table, their eyes flicking up as Poirot entered, their expressions wary. Harrington, his tall, gaunt frame casting a long shadow across the flagstone floor, stepped forward, his thin hands clasped before him in a posture of rigid control. "Monsieur Poirot," the butler said, his voice steady but lacking its usual polished calm, "how may I assist you?" Poirot's eyes sparkled with the quiet satisfaction of a hunter who has just caught the first scent of his prey. "Ah, my good Harrington," he said, his tone deceptively mild, "I believe you are the man to shed light on a small mystery that has thus far eluded me. You see, I have recently come into possession of an item, a small box, carefully hidden. I suspect you might know something of its contents." Harrington's pale face grew, if possible, even paler, his thin lips pressing tightly together, his eyes darting briefly toward the kitchen door as though calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Poirot watched him closely, his sharp eyes missing nothing, his mind already fitting this newest piece into the ever-evolving puzzle. And as Harrington's gaze dropped to the worn, scuffed toes of his polished shoes, Poirot felt the quiet thrill of revelation begin to stir once more. Harrington's jaw tightened, his thin, angular face momentarily betraying a flicker of unease before his habitual, impassive mask snapped back into place. Poirot watched him closely, noting the subtle clenching of the butler's long fingers, the slight tightening of his shoulders. The man's initial reaction had been telling, a momentary lapse that revealed far more than a lengthy interrogation might have. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, his sharp eyes fixed on the butler's face, waiting for the man to speak. When Harrington finally met his gaze, his voice was carefully controlled, each word measured, precise. "I'm afraid, Monsieur Poirot, that I do not know what you mean," Harrington said, his tone cool but lacking its usual calm. "I am, of course, at your disposal, but I cannot imagine what relevance a mere box might have to this tragedy." Poirot smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips that did little to soften the intensity of his gaze. "Ah, but you see, my friend, In matters of murder, it is often the smallest, most seemingly inconsequential details that prove most illuminating. A single hair, a misplaced cufflink, an overlooked footprint, these things they speak volumes to those who listen carefully. Harrington's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching slightly. I assure you, sir, I have nothing to hide. My loyalty to Sir Charles and Lady Weatherby is beyond question. Poirot tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. Indeed, loyalty is a most admirable quality, yet even the most loyal of servants cannot help but observe the secrets of those they serve. You, Harrington, you have seen much, I suspect. Heard even more. And perhaps, just perhaps, you have stumbled upon a truth you would rather not acknowledge. Harrington's thin lips pressed together, his eyes flicking momentarily to the other members of the household staff clustered near the kitchen door, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. Poirot caught the brief, nervous glance and felt the first whisper of certainty, the faint but unmistakable sense that he was drawing closer to the heart of the matter. "Monsieur Poirot," Harrington said, his voice low, almost a growl, "I do not appreciate being accused of—" Poirot raised a placating hand, his tone softening. "No, no, my friend. I accuse you of nothing. I merely observe, as is my habit. You are a man of routine, of precision, n'est-ce pas? A man who values order and discipline. It must have been quite unsettling, then, to find your well-ordered world thrown into chaos by this unfortunate event." Harrington's shoulders relaxed slightly, his eyes losing some of their sharpness. Poirot noted the subtle shift, the faint loosening of the butler's rigid posture. He had struck a nerve, tapped into the man's deep-seated need for control, for stability. "Yes," Harrington admitted grudgingly, his gaze dropping to the worn, polished stones beneath his feet. "It has been difficult. Miss Lyle was a fixture in this household. Her death is a loss." Poirot allowed a small, sympathetic nod, his expression thoughtful. Of course, of course. But tell me, Harrington, did you notice anything unusual about Miss Lyle in recent days? Perhaps a change in her demeanor, a hint of fear or anxiety?" Harrington hesitated, his eyes shifting to the side, his thin fingers twisting together in a rare display of nervousness. She was distracted, perhaps. Not quite herself. She spent more time in the library than usual, and she seemed wary, as though she were expecting something. Poirot's eyes brightened, his mustache lifting at the corners. "Ah, and did she perhaps receive any visitors? Letter, a phone call, something that might have disturbed her?" Harrington hesitated again, his brows drawing together in a tight, worried line. "There was a letter," he said slowly, his voice low. "It arrived 2 days ago, by special courier. She received it in the morning just after breakfast. I thought nothing of it at the time, but—" Poirot's sharp mind leapt ahead, his thoughts spinning rapidly. A letter delivered in secret, perhaps containing the very knowledge that had driven Margaret to her untimely death. He leaned in, his eyes fixed on Harrington's pale, strained face. "And did you see the letter, my friend? Perhaps you caught a glimpse of the handwriting, the seal, the return address?" Harrington's jaw tightened again, his eyes narrowing as though the question itself were an affront. "No, monsieur, I did not. Miss Lyle was a private person, and I would never dream of prying into her affairs." Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs with the same careful precision with which he arranged the facts of the case in his mind. "Of course not, Harrington. You are a man of discretion. But if you should recall any further details, however small, you will inform me. Yes?" Harrington inclined his head, his thin frame stiffening once more into its customary, rigid posture. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. You have my word." Poirot inclined his head in return, his sharp eyes lingering on the butler's pale, pinched face for a moment longer before he turned, and made his way back down the hallway, his mind already sorting through the implications of this newest revelation. A letter. A message, perhaps, from an old acquaintance or a shadowy adversary. The key to Margaret Lyle's final days, to the truth that had driven her to the edge of reason and, ultimately, to her death. As Poirot reached the grand staircase, the faint strains of a distant piano reached his ears, the delicate notes weaving through the air like the whispered secrets of a forgotten past. He paused, his head tilting slightly as he listened, his mind sharp, his thoughts quickening. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, each fragment revealing a new layer of intrigue, a fresh hint of betrayal. And already, Poirot felt the familiar, electric thrill of revelation stirring within him. He straightened his jacket, his polished shoes tapping softly against the polished wood as he descended the staircase, his thoughts turning now to the final, critical stages of the game, a game that would soon reveal the true face of the killer, the hidden hand behind Margaret Lyle's tragic end. Poirot reached the foot of the grand staircase, his thoughts weaving through the myriad threads of the case. Each small revelation, each whispered fear, forming an intricate pattern within his mind. He paused for a moment in the shadowed alcove beneath the sweeping curve of the banister, his sharp eyes narrowing as he considered the implications of Harrington's words. A letter delivered in secret, a private correspondence hidden from prying eyes. It was a detail too precise, too deliberate to be merely incidental. He stepped into the drawing room, where the low murmur of nervous conversation filled the air like the hum of restless bees. The guests, clustered in small, anxious groups, fell silent as Poirot entered, their eyes flicking toward him with barely concealed curiosity. He felt the weight of their collective unease, the sharp, anxious glances, the whispered suspicions, and allowed himself a small, inward smile. Lady Weatherby had retreated to a high-backed chair near the fire, her pale hands twisting the delicate lace of her sleeve, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames as though seeking some comfort in their steady, rhythmic dance. Beside her, Miss Cavendish sat stiffly, her sharp, dark eyes tracking Poirot's every movement with a hawk-like intensity. Poirot crossed the room with deliberate, measured steps, his polished shoes whispering against the thick Persian carpet, his posture as precise and immaculate as ever. He paused before Lady Weatherby, inclining his head in a small, formal gesture of respect. "Madame," he said gently, his voice low yet firm. "May I have a word?" Lady Weatherby's head lifted slowly, her blue eyes widening slightly as they met Poirot's steady, unblinking gaze. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the lace, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it you wish to ask?" Poirot glanced briefly at Miss Cavendish, whose lips had tightened into a thin, bloodless line, her dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. He allowed himself a small, polite smile, then turned his full attention back to Lady Weatherby. "Madame," he began, his tone light yet probing, "I have recently learned that Miss Lyle received a letter delivered by special courier just 2 days ago. It is my understanding that such a thing is quite out of the ordinary for her." Lady Weatherby's pale face blanched further, her eyes dropping to her tightly clasped hands. "A letter," she whispered, her voice faint. I was not aware." Poirot leaned in slightly, his sharp eyes catching the faint flicker of panic in her gaze. "Indeed, madam. A letter delivered in secret, perhaps containing words of warning or a threat, or even a declaration of a long-buried truth. It is a curious thing, is it not?" Lady Weatherby's breath caught, her eyes darting briefly to Miss Cavendish, who had stiffened visibly, her slender fingers curling tightly around the arm of her chair. Poirot noted the reaction, his mind filing it away for later examination. I cannot imagine who would send such a thing," Lady Weatherby stammered, her voice thin and brittle. "Margaret, she was so private, so quiet. I cannot believe she would have kept such a matter from me." Poirot's sharp eyes did not miss the faint, almost imperceptible tightening of Miss Cavendish's jaw, the slight flaring of her delicate nostrils. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the striking woman's sharp, dark eyes. "Mademoiselle Cavendish," he said, his tone soft, yet edged with a hint of challenge. "You were, I believe, a friend of Miss Lyle, were you not? Surely you would have noticed if she had been acting strangely in recent days." Miss Cavendish's eyes flicked briefly to Lady Weatherby, her lips parting in a small, almost feline smile. "I hardly think our relationship could be described as friendship, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her tone cool, her words precise. "Margaret was a secretary, a servant. She was competent, yes, but we were hardly confidant." Poirot's head tilted slightly, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Ah, but you see, mademoiselle, in matters of the heart and mind, the barriers of class are often more porous than one might think. It is possible, is it not, that Miss Lyle confided in you, that she shared with you some small secret, a whisper of doubt, a hint of fear?" Miss Cavendish's dark eyes flashed, her mouth tightening into a thin, bloodless line. "I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I know nothing of this letter or its contents. If Margaret had secrets, she kept them well hidden." Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Indeed, mademoiselle, and yet secrets have a way of revealing themselves, do they not? Even the most carefully concealed truths will, in time, come to light." Miss Cavendish's eyes narrowed, her slender fingers tightening further around the arm of her chair, her knuckles whitening against the dark, polished wood. Poirot noted the reaction, the faint tremor in her hand, the sharp, angry flare in her eyes, and felt the first whisper of certainty, the quiet, thrilling sense that he was drawing closer to the heart of the mystery. He straightened, his gaze moving briefly to Lady Weatherby, who had sunk back into her chair, her pale, trembling hands still twisting the delicate lace of her sleeve. Poirot felt a small pang of sympathy for the frail, terrified woman, but he did not allow it to distract him. "Merci, madame," he said softly, inclining his head once more. "You have been most helpful." He turned, his steps slow and measured as he made his way toward the hallway, his sharp mind already leaping ahead, connecting fragments of overheard conversations, whispered fears, and half-hidden glances. As he reached the doorway, he paused, his head tilting slightly as though listening to a distant, echoing whisper. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, each small detail revealing a fresh layer of intrigue, a new hint of betrayal. And already Poirot felt the familiar, electric thrill of revelation stirring within him. The game was afoot, the dance of deception and discovery moving ever closer to its final, inevitable conclusion. And in the shadowed halls of the Weatherby estate, the truth, long hidden, was beginning to stir, its dark tendrils reaching out toward the light. Poirot left the drawing room, his thoughts weaving a complex tapestry of whispered fears, hidden secrets, and tightly held grudges. He moved with careful, measured steps through the shadowed corridors of the Weatherby estate, his sharp eyes noting each small detail, each barely perceptible crack in the facade of wealth and respectability. The soft creak of polished wood beneath his shoes, the faint scent of old, polished leather, the whisper of distant voices drifting from the servants' quarters. All these things spoke to him, each a piece of the greater puzzle he was slowly assembling. He reached the small study where Sir Charles had once spent his evenings, the heavy door slightly ajar, its brass handle cool beneath his fingers. Poirot pushed it open and stepped inside, his sharp gaze sweeping over the dark paneled walls, the neatly ordered bookshelves, the sturdy mahogany desk still covered with neatly arranged papers and correspondence. He crossed to the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the stacks of letters and documents, each arranged with the same precise care that Sir Charles had demanded of his household. Yet, amidst the order, Poirot detected a subtle note of discord. A single, pale blue envelope set slightly askew, its edges frayed as though it had been handled more roughly than the others. He reached for the envelope, his fingers closing gently around the crisp, cool paper. It bore no return address, no official seal, only Sir Charles's name, written in a precise, slanting hand that struck Poirot as both familiar and yet subtly unfamiliar. He turned it over, his sharp eyes narrowing as he noted the faint smudge of ink near the corner, the slight irregularity in the curve of the final letter, as though the writer's hand had trembled ever so slightly. Poirot slipped the letter from its envelope, unfolding the single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper within. His sharp eyes moved quickly over the neatly written lines, his mind already leaping ahead, drawing connections, fitting each small piece into its proper place. My dear Sir Charles, you have hidden your secrets well, but even the most carefully guarded truths cannot remain concealed forever. The past has a way of catching up with us, and yours is no exception. Be warned, I know the truth, and I will not remain silent. You may seek to silence me, but I will not be so easily cowed. Yours, a friend. Poirot's lips tightened, his sharp eyes narrowing as he folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. The language, the tone, it was a direct challenge, a threat wrapped in the thin, brittle veneer of civility. He had no doubt that Sir Charles, for all his bluster and bravado, had taken it seriously. He slipped the envelope into his pocket, his mind already racing ahead, fitting this newest piece into the ever-shifting puzzle. A threat delivered in secret, couched in the careful language of an old acquaintance or a bitter enemy. And, more importantly, a letter that had gone unreported, hidden from the prying eyes of the household, perhaps even from Lady Weatherby herself. Poirot straightened, his sharp eyes sweeping over the study one final time, his mind sorting through the implications of this newest revelation. He turned and stepped back into the hallway, his polished shoes tapping softly against the polished wood, his thoughts already moving to the next critical piece of the puzzle. He paused at the base of the grand staircase, his head tilting slightly as he caught the faint, muffled strains of a whispered conversation drifting from the parlor at the far end of the hall. Poirot moved quietly, his steps light, his ears straining to catch each faint, hurried word. As he approached, the voices grew clearer, their tones sharp, anxious. He recognized them at once, the low, gruff growl of Inspector Felton, his words clipped and precise, and the softer, more tremulous tones of Lady Weatherby. Poirot hesitated for a moment, then stepped lightly into the doorway, his sharp eyes taking in the scene at a glance. Lady Weatherby sat stiffly on the edge of a low, velvet-covered settee, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide, her expression one of barely controlled panic. Felton loomed over her, his broad shoulders hunched, his square, clean-shaven jaw set in a grim, determined line. "Come now, milady," Felton said, his voice low but firm, his eyes fixed on the trembling woman before him. "You must tell me the truth. If there is something you know, some secret you have kept, now is the time to reveal it. We cannot help you if you insist on clinging to these half-truths and evasions." Lady Weatherby's pale lips parted, a faint, breathless whisper escaping her as she met the inspector's hard, unyielding gaze. I have told you all that I know," she stammered, her voice thin, fragile. I do not understand." Poirot stepped forward, his polished shoes whispering against the thick carpet, his sharp eyes fixed on the trembling woman's pale, terrified face. "Lady Weatherby," he said gently, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife through fine silk. "I believe you do understand. You have known, perhaps for some time, that the past has a way of catching up with us, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find their way to the surface." Lady Weatherby's wide, fearful eyes snapped to his, her thin, trembling hands clenching tightly in her lap, her breath catching in her throat. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes bright with a sudden, desperate fear. What are you saying?" Poirot stepped closer. his sharp, unblinking gaze never leaving her. Stricken face. "I am saying, madame, that the past is not so easily forgotten, that old sins have a way of returning to haunt us, and that those who seek to conceal the truth must, in the end, face its terrible, inescapable light." Lady Weatherby's pale lips quivered, her eyes filling with sudden, unbidden tears, her slender shoulders trembling beneath the weight of her unspoken fears. Felton straightened, his square jaw tightening, his keen, watchful eyes flicking briefly to Poirot's calm, implacable face, then back to the trembling figure before him. And in that breathless, electrified silence, Poirot felt the final, critical pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place, each small, carefully concealed secret revealing itself at last, each whispered fear, each half-hidden truth drawing him ever closer to the heart of the mystery, to the final, inevitable revelation that would soon lay the entire twisted affair bare. Poirot observed Lady Weatherby with a quiet intensity, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to compel honesty. She looked ready to collapse beneath the weight of her own withheld confessions. Her lips trembled, and then, perhaps because there was nothing else to do, or because Poirot's presence seemed to promise a kind of absolution, she spoke. "It was just a letter," she said hoarsely. "Just one. I destroyed it." Felton leaned forward. "A letter? From whom?" "I don't know," she whispered, shaking her head. "It came 3 days before before he died. I read it. He never saw it. I panicked." Poirot's expression did not change, but a flicker of interest glinted in his eyes. "And what did it say, madame?" She closed her eyes tightly, as if forcing herself to recall. It said he was being watched, that if he didn't withdraw from some business deal, something to do with land acquisition, his past would be revealed. It mentioned a place, Westgate. That was all. It sounded like blackmail. Poirot nodded very slightly, his thoughts already churning behind the composed mask of his face. "And you destroyed it because—" "I thought it was just someone trying to frighten him. Charles had many enemies in business. I didn't want him to worry. He had been under strain lately. I thought I was protecting him." Her voice cracked. "But I was wrong, wasn't I?" Poirot didn't answer. He simply gave her a slight, almost sorrowful nod and turned away. Felton was scribbling into his notebook furiously, but Poirot's mind was elsewhere. Westgate. That was a detail worth turning over. He excused himself and left the drawing room behind, walking through the long corridor with the air of a man suddenly seeing a different picture emerge from an old painting. The name Westgate echoed in his mind. Not just a place, perhaps, but a memory. In the modest library adjacent to the main hall, Poirot found Miss Evelyn Blakemore seated at the writing desk, flipping distractedly through a volume of memoirs. She looked up as he entered, visibly tense. "Mademoiselle," he began gently, "you are fond of secrets, are you not?" Her eyes narrowed warily. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot approached slowly. "You knew more about Sir Charles' business dealings than you admitted, I think. And you may not have understood them entirely, but you knew enough to be frightened when a threat arrived." She set the book down, her jaw tightening. "What are you implying, Monsieur Poirot?" "That perhaps you were the first to read the letter Lady Weatherby mentioned. That perhaps you intercepted it." Her lips parted in protest, but he raised a hand. "No denials yet, mademoiselle. Consider, you are the secretary. You would have sorted Sir Charles' correspondence. You would have known his schedule, his financial involvements. And you were loyal to him. Fiercely so. Were you not?" Her expression wavered. "Yes, I respected him. He trusted me. Which is why you feared what the letter meant. You saw it before anyone else, and it disturbed you. That is why you grew cold, withdrawn, why your hands trembled when we first spoke. You thought he was being threatened by someone from his past, or someone much closer." Miss Blakemore sat in silence, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Poirot stepped closer. "The name Westgate, what does it mean to you?" She shook her head slowly. "Nothing. I swear. I saw it in the letter. I remembered it, that's all. It frightened me because I could tell it frightened whoever wrote the letter. But I don't know what it refers to." Poirot studied her for a moment, then turned. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have helped more than you know." As he stepped out into the hallway once more, Poirot caught sight of Mr. Adrian Venn descending the staircase, his manner unusually brisk. He held a satchel under one arm and wore a faintly smug expression, an effect that had not escaped Poirot's notice since the very beginning. "Ah, Monsieur Venn," Poirot called softly. "A word, if you please." Venn's steps faltered slightly, but he turned with a half-smile. "Of course. What can I do for you?" Poirot gestured toward the quiet alcove at the base of the stairs, and Venn followed reluctantly. "You knew Sir Charles well, did you not?" Poirot asked. "Well enough, yes. I wouldn't say we were close, but I advised him on his investments." "And yet you failed to mention his business dealings in Westgate." Venn stiffened. "I didn't think it was relevant. Those dealings never amounted to anything." "Indeed." Poirot's brows rose. "I think you underestimate their relevance, monsieur. The letter that threatened him mentioned Westgate." Venn swallowed. "And someone must have known about it. But it wasn't serious. A failed development plan. Some legal trouble with ownership. Sir Charles dropped it when it became too complicated." Poirot nodded. "And you lost money in the process, did you not?" A flush rose in Venn's cheeks. "I advised him to hold the investment. He didn't listen, but I've no grudge." Poirot regarded him silently for a long moment, then said, "You strike me as a man who dislikes being ignored, a man who prefers to hold all the cards." Venn's eyes hardened. "What are you insinuating?" "Nothing. Only that your alibi for the night Sir Charles died is thin. You said you were in the garden. No one saw you, no one heard you, and when the body was found, you were curiously quick to declare it a natural death." Venn began, but Poirot raised a hand again. "It is not an accusation, monsieur. Not yet. But do not be too quick to dismiss the significance of old failures and bruised pride." Poirot turned and walked away, leaving Venn frozen, clutching his satchel a little too tightly. Outside, the light had dimmed. The day had turned grey, with low clouds blanketing the sky. Poirot stood near the stone balustrade of the terrace and watched as Inspector Felton approached from the other end of the grounds. "Something new?" the inspector asked. Poirot gave a slight nod. "The name Westgate appears to bind our suspects together more closely than I first imagined. Sir Charles' wife tried to suppress a threatening letter that mentioned it. His secretary feared it. Mr. Venn has financial wounds tied to it, and yet none of them speak of it freely." Felton frowned. "What exactly happened in Westgate?" Poirot tapped his chin. "That, mon ami, is the very question, and I believe the answer lies in the past. We must dig deeper. There is something that happened there, perhaps long ago, that binds this entire affair. A wrong deed, a hidden truth, and perhaps a motive for murder." Felton looked at him, the wind rustling his coat. "You think this isn't just about money or property?" "No," Poirot said quietly. "It is about guilt. And guilt, Inspector, is the most insidious of motives, for it eats away at the conscience and drives even the most rational person to desperate acts." The clouds above shifted slightly, a dim light piercing the veil of grey. Poirot gazed upward, then turned back toward the house. "It is time," he murmured, "to gather everyone. The time for secrets is ending." The drawing-room was arranged with meticulous symmetry. Chairs pulled into a gentle arc before the fireplace, where a small blaze crackled in anticipation. The household had been summoned, each individual drifting in with the uneasy air of those about to be judged. No one spoke. Even the clinking of Lady Weatherby's teacup as she set it down seemed unnaturally loud. Poirot stood at the center, hands neatly clasped before him, eyes gleaming with that distinctive fire of concentration. Inspector Felton hovered near the door, notebook ready but unused, already understanding that he would not be the one guiding this moment. This belonged to Poirot, and Poirot alone. "My friends," the Belgian began with quiet authority, "you are gathered here not merely because of suspicion, but because I believe the truth must now come to light." He looked from face to face. Lady Weatherby, pale but composed, Evelyn Blakemore, visibly trembling, Adrian Venn rigid with watchful arrogance, and young Stephen Darrow, whose eyes darted toward the window as if half hoping to escape this ordeal. "It is curious, is it not?" Poirot continued, "how easily we allow ourselves to be misled by appearances. A man dies quietly in his study, no signs of struggle, no evident foul play. And yet, as I have discovered, beneath the tranquil surface there swirls a storm of deception, of fear, and, yes, of guilt." He turned to Lady Weatherby. "You destroyed the letter because you believed it was only a threat, but it contained a truth that others wished hidden, a reference to Westgate, a place that unites more than one of you in history, in regret, and perhaps in vengeance." Lady Weatherby clutched her scarf, eyes wide. "But Charles never mentioned Westgate to me. I swear it." "He would not have needed to," Poirot said softly, "because he was running from it, from something that happened there nearly 20 years ago. Something involving not just Sir Charles, but 2 others in this very room." He shifted his gaze to Adrian Venn, whose composure had begun to crack. "You, Monsieur Venn, were involved in the Westgate investment not only as an advisor. You were a partner. You and Sir Charles acquired land under false pretenses. There were lawsuits, inquiries, even rumors of bribery. But most damning," Poirot's voice slowed, sharpened, "was the death of a young man, a protester who challenged the development. He was found drowned in a nearby river. His name was Lionel Darrow." All heads turned toward Stephen, who had gone deathly still. My father," he said, barely above a whisper. Poirot nodded solemnly. "Oui, monsieur, he was your father." The silence was shattered. "You never knew," Poirot said gently. "You were only a child. Your mother raised you away from the scandal, changed your surname slightly. But I found the record of the death, the closed investigation, the discreet financial settlements. Sir Charles and Mr. Venn walked away, but your mother never forgot. And neither, it seems, did you." Stephen looked up now, no longer shocked but hollow. He never faced justice. "No," Poirot agreed. "But you were not the only one who bore that grudge. There was someone else who knew the story, who pieced it together more recently, and who tried to protect the man they loved from a truth they feared would destroy him." His eyes fell on Evelyn Blakemore. She shook her head once. "No, I didn't." "Mademoiselle," Poirot interrupted kindly, "you recognized Lionel Darrow's name. That is why the letter frightened you. You remembered the name from an old article. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps from overhearing Sir Charles speak of it long ago. You confronted him, didn't you?" She looked down, lips tight. "I did. A few weeks ago. I asked if it was true. He denied it, but I could tell. And I realized I could never admire him the way I once did." Poirot turned back to the group. "And that is when the past became dangerous. The letter arrived shortly after. Someone had discovered the truth.